Hello, everyone. I am Mr. X Black. I am here to help you today. I know you watch videos before sleeping. So before that, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment. Where are you from? And what time are you watching? Let's relax with me at horror stories with rain sounds and black-green save energy. Have a good night. I don't talk about what happened that night at Blackwater Lake. Not to the police. Not to the families. Not to the therapists they keep sending me to. But I'll tell you. Maybe then you'll understand why I never sleep anymore. Why I can't look at water without shaking. Why I wake up screaming, feeling phantom fingers pulling me down, down, down. We were 4 friends who had known each other since childhood. Mike Lawson, the leader of our little group, always organizing our adventures. We met in 3rd grade when he defended me from bullies on the playground. He was fearless even then, 6 feet tall by high school, with a booming laugh and shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of everyone else's problems. Mike was the one who pushed us to try new things, to step outside our comfort zones. Life begins at the edge of your fears, he used to say. Sarah Chun, brilliant and skeptical, always ready with a logical explanation. She joined our group in middle school, a transfer student with glasses too big for her face and a brain too big for our small town. National Merit Scholar. Full ride to Cornell for biochemistry. She was supposed to cure cancer someday. That's what we all believed. Sarah never accepted anything at face value. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, she'd quote. Usually while debunking whatever conspiracy theory Dave was obsessed with that week. Dave Mercer, the joker who could make us laugh even at the worst of times. His parents' divorce hit him hard in 5th grade, but you'd never know it from his constant smile. He used humor like a shield, deflecting pain with punchlines. He was the shortest of us, but made up for it with a personality twice his size. Dave was the one who got us through our darkest times, breakups, rejections, family troubles. If you're not laughing, you're not living, was his motto. And me, Daniel Cooper, the quiet one, the observer, the writer, the survivor. People often wondered why I was part of the group. I wasn't brave like Mike, or brilliant like Sarah, or funny like Dave. I was just there, watching, remembering. Perhaps that's why I'm the one left to tell this story. The universe needs its witnesses. We had all moved away after high school, scattered to different colleges, different lives. But we made a pact to reunite every summer, to keep our friendship alive despite the distance. For 7 years, we'd managed it. Camping trips, road trips, music festivals, creating new memories to sustain us through the months apart. This summer, our last summer, though we didn't know it then, Mike had the idea for a night fishing trip at Blackwater Lake. None of us had been there before, but Mike had heard stories about the size of the catfish. Trophy-sized, he called them. What he didn't mention were the other stories. The ones about Blackwater Lake that the locals whispered about. The missing persons reports that stretched back a century. I learned about those later. Too late. We arrived just before sunset on a Friday in late July. The lake was beautiful in that melancholy way that isolated places can be. Mirror-smooth water reflecting the dying sun. Ancient trees huddled around the shoreline like mourners at a funeral. Silence, except for the occasional call of a bird. I remember the smell, earthy and primal, like freshly turned soil and something else beneath it. Something older. The air felt heavy, not just with humidity, but with anticipation. As though the landscape itself was holding its breath, waiting. This place gives me the creeps, Sarah said as we unloaded our gear from Mike's trusty Jeep. She was wearing her standard camping outfit, practical khaki shorts, a Columbia fishing shirt with too many pockets, and hiking boots that had seen better days. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, revealing the small birthmark behind her left ear that she usually kept hidden. Dave laughed, pulling his lucky fishing hat lower over his eyes. It was ridiculous, covered with colorful lures and patches from places he'd never actually been. Don't tell me you believe in ghost stories, Dr. Chun. Isn't that against your scientific code or something? Sarah punched his arm playfully. It's not ghosts I'm worried about. It's the statistical likelihood of 4 city kids getting lost in unfamiliar wilderness. Plus, there's no cell service out here. She held up her phone as evidence. If one of us gets hurt, we're on our own. That's the point, Mike said, hoisting a cooler onto his shoulder like it weighed nothing. Unplugging, reconnecting with nature, and each other. He had that look in his eyes, the one that meant he'd already made up his mind and no amount of logical arguments would change it. When was the last time the 4 of us were together without screens between us? He had a point. Even our regular reunions had devolved into 4 people sitting in the same room, each scrolling through their phones. We were together but separate, connected to everyone except those right in front of us. Mike handed out beers from the cooler, already cold and sweating in the summer heat. To the best night of fishing in our lives. We clinked our bottles together. A toast, a promise, a farewell, though we didn't know it yet. To friends, I added quietly. To escaping the real world, Dave said. To actually catching something for once, Sarah finished with a smirk. If only we had known. We set up our camp on a small clearing about 20 yards from the shore. 4 tents arranged in a semicircle around what would become our fire pit. Mike and I gathered wood while Sarah organized our supplies with her typical precision. Dave, meanwhile, attempted to untangle the fishing lines he'd managed to knot during the drive. Seriously, how do you even do that? Sarah asked, eyeing the bird's nest of monofilament in his hands. It's a gift, Dave replied with a grin. Some people are born with musical talent. I was born with the ability to tangle anything with a length greater than 6 inches. That's what she said. Mike called from the edge of the clearing, his arms full of kindling. We all groaned at the tired joke, but there was comfort in the familiarity. This was us. This was how we'd always been together. For a moment, I felt a pang of nostalgia so sharp it was almost physical. A premonition, perhaps, that these ordinary moments, the jokes, the teasing, the easy camaraderie, were precious and fleeting. As night fell, we built a fire and cooked the steaks Mike had brought, along with corn on the cob and potatoes wrapped in foil to bake in the embers. We ate well, reminiscing about past adventures and updating each other on our current lives. Mike had just been promoted at his architectural firm. Sarah was considering a research position that would delay her medical school plans. Dave had finally started the comedy podcast he'd been talking about for years. When they asked about me, I didn't mention the nightmares that had plagued me for months. The ones where I was drowning, pulled down by unseen hands while familiar voices called my name from the depths. I didn't tell them about the growing sense of dread that had followed me to the lake. Instead, I talked about my new job editing for an online magazine. Safe, normal, boring. After dinner, we cast our lines into the dark water. The moon rose, nearly full, casting everything in a silvery glow that made the landscape look alien and wrong somehow. The trees cast shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The water gleamed like polished obsidian. For hours, nothing happened. Not even a nibble. The conversation dwindled as we focused on our fishing, the silence broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire or the soft pop of another beer being opened. I don't think there are any fish in this lake, Dave complained around midnight, reeling in his empty line for the dozenth time. Not even a single bite. Maybe they're just nocturnal, Mike suggested, though his earlier enthusiasm had dimmed considerably. The guy at the bait shop said they bite best after midnight. Sarah snorted. The guy at the bait shop also had a stuffed jackalope on his wall and tried to sell us Bigfoot repellent. Hey, better safe than sorry. Dave patted his pocket where he'd stashed the small spray bottle labeled Bigfoot Be Gone that he'd purchased for $5. Though I'm starting to think we got scammed on the whole best fishing in the state thing. That's when we heard it. A splash, too large to be a fish, somewhere in the darkness beyond our lamplight. We all froze, our conversation forgotten. What was that? Sarah whispered, her scientific skepticism momentarily replaced by the primal human fear of unexpected sounds in the dark. Probably a deer, Mike said, but he didn't sound convinced. His eyes scanned the shoreline, squinting to see beyond our circle of light. The splash was followed by silence, heavy and expectant. I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear anything above the subtle lapping of water against the shore and the distant call of a nightboard. Sarah checked her phone again, a nervous habit. Still no signal. Typical. We should tell ghost stories, Dave suggested, trying to lighten the mood. Isn't that what you're supposed to do on camping trips? Scare each other with tales of hooks for hands and escaped lunatics. But before anyone could begin, we heard it again. A splash, closer this time. And then something else. A sound that might have been singing, but at a pitch so low it was almost below hearing. More like feeling the sound in your chest than actually hearing it. What is that? I whispered, my mouth suddenly dry. Nothing, Mike insisted, though he'd risen to his feet, his fishing rod forgotten. Wind in the trees. But there was no wind. The air was still, oppressively so, as though the night itself were holding its breath. The singing grew gradually louder. It was beautiful in a way that made your skin crawl. Wordless, ancient, hungry. Dave stood up suddenly, nearly knocking over his chair. There's something out there. In the water. We all strained to see. At first, there was nothing. Just black water reflecting the moon. Then we saw it. Ripples, moving toward shore. Toward us. It's just fish, Mike said, but his voice had gone high and tight. I'd never heard him sound afraid before. Not when we'd gotten lost in the Adirondacks for 2 days. Not when a black bear wandered through our campsite in Yellowstone. Not even when he'd broken his leg in 3 places during a rock climbing accident and had to be carried down the mountain. Mike Lawson was afraid. And that, more than anything else, terrified me. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and shined it out over the water. The beam caught something pale just beneath the surface. Something large. That's not a fish, she whispered. The singing stopped abruptly. For a moment, everything was still. Even the normal sounds of the forest, insects, birds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, had gone silent. It was as though the entire ecosystem was holding its breath, waiting. I'm getting out of here, Dave said, already backing away from the shore. This is some horror movie shit, and I'm not sticking around to be the comic relief guy who dies first. That's when the water erupted. I can't properly describe what we saw. My mind won't let me remember it clearly. Pale limbs, too long and too numerous. A face or faces that seemed to shift and change when you looked at them. And eyes, so many eyes, glowing with a cold light like the deepest parts of the ocean where no sunlight has ever reached. The creature, if that's what it was, rose from the water in a cascade of droplets that caught the moonlight like falling diamonds. It was beautiful and terrible, a contradiction that my brain couldn't process. Something that should not exist in our rational world of smartphones and streaming services and climate-controlled offices. We ran. All of us, abandoning our gear, fled into the woods surrounding the lake. That was our first mistake. We should have stayed together, made it back to the car. Instead, panic scattered us like leaves in the wind. I could hear the others crashing through the underbrush, their terrified breathing. And behind us, something large moving through the trees. Not running, almost gliding. The underbrush didn't seem to slow it down. Nothing did. The singing started again, closer now. All around us. It sounded like a chorus of voices, all singing slightly different melodies that somehow harmonized into something both discordant and mesmerizing. I found myself wanting to stop, to listen more closely, to understand the words that seemed just on the edge of comprehension. Mike screamed first, a short, shocked sound that cut off abruptly. It came from somewhere to my right, deeper in the woods than I'd gone. "Mike!" I shouted, changing direction, moving toward where I'd heard him. "Mike, where are you?" No answer. Just the singing, taking on a mocking quality now, as though amused by our fear. Then Sarah screamed, somewhere to my left. Her scream lasted longer, rising in pitch until it became something no human throat should make, a sound that still haunts my dreams. I froze, paralyzed by indecision. Mike to the right, Sarah to the left. Which way should I go? Who should I try to save? In the end, my body decided for me. I kept running straight ahead, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. Self-preservation overrode loyalty and friendship. I'm not proud of it, but I'm alive because of it. I heard Dave somewhere ahead of me, his breathing ragged. He'd always been the slowest runner among us, a fact we'd teased him about during our school days. But fear had given him speed tonight. "Dave," I called out. "Wait. We need to stick together." He didn't answer, but something else did. The singing changed, mimicking my voice perfectly. "Wait," it sang. "We need to stick together." I stumbled to a halt, my blood turning to ice in my veins. It could imitate us. It was learning from us. For a moment, I stood frozen among the trees, my breath coming in short, painful gasps. I couldn't tell which direction was which anymore. The moonlight filtered through the canopy in patches, creating a disorienting pattern of light and shadow. The ground sloped downward in all directions, as though I stood on a small island in a sea of darkness. I forced myself to think, to plan. The car. We needed to get back to the car. But which way was it? We'd parked near the only access road, which had been to the east, west. I couldn't remember, couldn't orient myself. A twig snapped nearby, and I whirled toward the sound, expecting to see pale limbs and glowing eyes. Instead, I saw Dave, his face scratched and bleeding, his lucky hat gone. "Dan," he gasped, grabbing my shoulders. "We need to go? Now. Where are the others?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. Dave just shook his head, his eyes wide and haunted. "The car. We need to get to the car." I nodded, grateful for the clarity of purpose. "Do you know which way?" He pointed, seemingly at random, but with such confidence that I believed him. "This way. I think I found a trail." We moved as quickly and quietly as we could through the underbrush, helping each other over fallen logs and around thorny bushes. For a few minutes, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe we would make it. Maybe we could get help for Mike and Sarah. The singing had stopped again, which I took as a good sign until I realized that the silence was even more unnatural. No insects. No night birds. Nothing. "Do you think it's gone?" I whispered to Dave. He didn't answer. "Dave?" I turned to look at him and froze. Dave was there, physically present beside me. But his eyes were wrong. They reflected the moonlight with the same cold glow I'd seen in the lake creature's eyes. "Dave?" I repeated, taking a step back. He smiled, but it wasn't Dave's smile. It was too wide, stretching his face in a way that human muscles shouldn't allow. "Dave?" The thing wearing my friend's face mimicked my questioning tone perfectly. I ran. Behind me, I heard Dave's body fall to the ground with a wet, heavy sound, like a water balloon bursting. I didn't look back. Couldn't bear to see what was now wearing his skin like an ill-fitting suit. The singing resumed, all around me now, ahead and behind, left and right, above, even, as though the very trees were joining the chorus. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost meaning. My world narrowed to the mechanics of survival. Feet pounding the earth, lungs burning, muscles screaming for rest. I ignored it all, driven by a terror so pure it transcended physical limitations. Eventually, I broke through the tree line and found myself back at the shore of the lake, but in a different spot than our campsite. The water stretched before me, calm and innocent under the moonlight, as though nothing had happened, as though it hadn't just taken 3 lives. I scanned the shoreline desperately, trying to orient myself. There, about a half-mile to my right, I could make out the dim glow of our campfire, still burning. The car would be nearby. Salvation. I began moving along the shore, staying in the tree line for cover, but keeping the water in sight to maintain my bearings. The singing had stopped again, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against my eardrums like deep water. I found Dave's body about halfway to camp, or what was left of it. His body looked deflated, like something had drained him from the inside out, leaving only an empty husk behind. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. There were no visible wounds, no blood, just a hollowed-out shell that had once contained my friend. I should have felt something: grief, horror, despair. But all I felt was a cold, clinical detachment. A part of my mind had simply shut down, refusing to process what I was seeing. Self-preservation, I suppose. The human psyche protecting itself from truths too terrible to bear. I continued toward camp, moving more cautiously now. When I reached the edge of our clearing, I paused, surveying the scene. Our tents stood undisturbed. The fire still burned low. Our fishing gear lay scattered where we dropped it in our panic. And there, illuminated by the dying firelight, was Mike's body, or what remained of it. I won't describe what I saw. Can't bring myself to put it into words. Some horrors are better left unspoken. All I'll say is that whatever had taken him had been thorough, methodical, almost curious, like a child pulling wings off a fly to see what happens. Of Sarah, there was no sign. I didn't know whether to feel relief or dread at her absence. The car keys would be in Mike's tent. He always kept them in the front pocket of his backpack, along with his wallet and multi-tool. I would need to get them if I wanted any chance of escape. I crept into the clearing, every sense straining for any sign of danger. The lake remained calm, the forest silent. Even the fires seemed to burn without sound, the flames dancing in a windless void. I reached Mike's tent without incident and ducked inside. His backpack sat exactly where I expected, leaning against his sleeping bag. I rifled through the front pocket with shaking hands and found the keys, along with his phone. No signal, as Sarah had discovered earlier, but its flashlight would be useful. As I backed out of the tent, I heard it, the singing directly behind me. I whirled around, nearly dropping the keys in my panic. Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing, her body silhouetted against the dark water beyond. She wasn't moving, just standing, perfectly still, her arms hanging limp at her sides. "Sarah?" I called softly, hope warring with suspicion. Had she escaped somehow? Found her way back to camp like I had. She turned her head toward me with a motion too smooth, too controlled to be natural. Her face caught the firelight, and I saw that her eyes were wrong, just like Dave's had been, glowing with that cold, inhuman light. Not Sarah. Not anymore. "Daniel," she said, but it wasn't her voice. It was like a dozen voices speaking in unison, some high, some low, some barely audible. "Stay with us, Daniel." I backed away, the keys clutched so tightly in my hand that they bit into my palm. Sarah, the thing wearing Sarah, took a step forward. Her movements were wrong, fluid yet jerky, as though whoever was operating her body hadn't quite mastered the mechanics of human locomotion. "We've been so lonely," the voices said through Sarah's mouth. "For so long." Another step forward. The firelight illuminated more of her now, and I could see that her clothes were soaking wet, clinging to her body. Water dripped from her hair, her fingertips, forming small puddles at her feet. "Stay," the voices urged. "Join your friends. Be part of us." Sarah's face twisted into what might have been meant as a smile, but looked more like a grimace of pain. Her jaw unhinged slightly, revealing teeth that gleamed too brightly in the firelight. Were there more of them than before? Sharper? I didn't stay to find out. I turned and ran for the Jeep, which was parked about 50 yards from our campsite on a dirt track that served as the lake's only access road. Behind me, I heard Sarah's body giving chase, her movements accompanied by wet, slapping sounds, and that ceaseless, maddening singing. I reached the Jeep and fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before managing to unlock the door and throw myself inside. The engine started on the first try, a small mercy in a night of horrors. Through the rearview mirror, I saw Sarah emerging from the trees, still moving with that unnatural gait. She was faster than she should have been, covering ground with a speed that defied human limitations. I threw the Jeep into reverse, then drive, peeling away down the dirt road as Sarah's body reached for the vehicle, fingers elongating impossibly to scrabble at the rear window. The road was treacherous, full of potholes and fallen branches that jarred the steering wheel in my hands. I drove too fast, recklessly, knowing that any accident would strand me here with the things from the lake. The headlights cut a swath through the darkness, illuminating the narrow track barely wide enough for the Jeep. I don't remember much of that drive. Adrenaline and terror have blurred the details into a smear of motion and fear. I know I nearly went off the road at least twice. I know I hit something at one point, a fallen log, or perhaps an animal, that sent the Jeep airborne briefly before crashing back to earth with a jolt that made my teeth snap together painfully. Eventually, the dirt track gave way to gravel, then to blessed asphalt. Civilization, or at least its outskirts. I didn't slow down, couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being pursued. I drove through the night, stopping only when the Jeep ran dangerously low on fuel. The gas station was closed, but the pumps were automated. I stood in the harsh fluorescent lighting, jumping at every sound as the tank filled. The night attendant watched me curiously from behind bulletproof glass, but didn't come out to investigate the wild-eyed man covered in dirt and scratches. Somehow I made it home. My apartment felt alien after what I'd experienced, its normality an affront to the new reality I'd been forced to confront. I locked the door, then wedged a chair under the knob for good measure. I checked every faucet, every drain, heart pounding at the thought of water. I couldn't bring myself to shower. Couldn't bear the thought of being vulnerable, naked, with water pouring over me. I don't remember much after that. Shock, the doctors told me later. My mind trying to protect itself from trauma. The authorities searched the area, of course. They found our campsite, our abandoned gear. They even found the bodies, eventually. What was left of them? The official report blamed animal attacks. Bears, they suggested. Or perhaps coyotes. I know better. They questioned me extensively. Where had I gone? Why had I left my friends? Why hadn't I called for help sooner? Their suspicion was palpable, though never explicitly stated. 3 people dead under mysterious circumstances, and the sole survivor with no coherent explanation. I told them a version of the truth. We'd heard something in the woods. We'd been separated while running away. I'd found the car and fled in panic. I left out the impossible parts. The singing, the thing in the lake, the way it had worn my friends like costumes. They didn't believe me, but they couldn't prove anything else. No evidence of foul play by human hands. No motive. Eventually, they stopped calling. The families were harder to face. Mike's parents, who had treated me like a second son. Sarah's mother, whose quiet grief seemed to fill every corner of her immaculate house. Dave's sister, the only family he had left, who flew in from Australia for the funeral. I attended all 3 services. Closed caskets, of course. I stood at the back, unable to meet anyone's eyes. What could I say? That their loved ones had been taken by something impossible? Something that science and religion alike had no framework to explain? So I said nothing, offered generic condolences, and then I withdrew from the world. I quit my job, moved to a new apartment in a different city, cut contact with everyone who knew me from before, started looking into the history of Blackwater Lake. What I found disturbed me more than I thought possible. The lake had claimed others before us. A group of campers in 1998, a family in 1973, 2 fishing buddies in 1952. All the way back to the early settlement of the area, there were records of disappearances. Indigenous legends that predated written history warned of a hungry place where water spirits devoured the unwary. Always the same pattern. Groups going missing. Sometimes a single survivor returning with tales of accident or animal attack. Sometimes no survivors at all. And always water. Drownings, even when the bodies were found far from shore. lungs full of lake water, even when the victims had died of apparently unrelated causes. I've spent the years since collecting these stories, mapping the incidents, looking for patterns, for explanations, for anything that might make sense of what happened that night. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that singing, coming from my bathroom sink, from puddles after rain, from the bottle of water on my nightstand. And I know it's still out there, waiting, patient as only ancient things can be. I've never gone fishing again, never gone swimming. I shower as quickly as possible, eyes always open, always watching the drain. I drink only bottled water, and even then, I check it carefully before each sip, looking for any sign of movement within. Because water is never just water anymore. Not for me. They're looking for me. You see, the things from Blackwater Lake. They're not finished with me. I've moved 7 times in 5 years. Each time, they find me eventually. I'll notice it first in my dreams, that familiar singing invading my sleep. Then small things, water faucets turning on by themselves, unexplained puddles on dry floors, the scent of lake water in a landlocked apartment. Then I know it's time to run again. I've tried telling others, therapists, paranormal researchers. Once, in a moment of desperate loneliness, a woman I'd been dating for a few months. Their reactions range from clinical concern to outright fear. Of me, not my story. No one believes. No one can help. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I think maybe I should just give in. Return to the lake. Wade into those black waters and let them take me. Join my friends in whatever existence they have now. Because the hardest part isn't the nightmares. It isn't the fear. It's the longing. Part of me wants to go back. Part of me misses the singing, finds it beautiful, feels drawn to it like an addict to their poison of choice. And that's what terrifies me most of all. The knowledge that whatever lives in Blackwater Lake isn't just hunting me, it's calling me. That maybe it didn't randomly choose our group that night. That maybe it wanted me specifically. For what purpose, I don't know. Don't want to know. I've started recording these audio journals as a precaution. If something happens to me, when something happens to me, I want there to be a record, a warning. Stay away from Blackwater Lake. Stay away from any body of water that feels too still, too watchful. Listen for the singing, and if you hear it, run. Run, and don't look back. But know this, running only delays the inevitable. Once they've noticed you, they never forget. Never stop hunting. I wonder sometimes about the other survivors throughout history. Did they feel it too? This constant pull, this terrible longing? Did they eventually give in? Return to whatever hunted them and surrender to its embrace? I think they must have. I can find no record of any survivor living to old age. They disappear sooner or later. No bodies found. Just gone. Like I will be someday. Voice dropping to almost a whisper. Listen, do you hear that? That sound, like water dripping somewhere nearby? It found me. Again. And now that you've heard my story, it knows about you too. They're drawn to awareness, you see. The mere act of knowing about them attracts their attention. Like thinking about a predator in the dark summoning its gaze. I'm sorry. I've endangered you by sharing this. But I needed someone to know. Someone to remember us. Mike, Sarah, Dave, and me when I'm gone. Remember us. But for your own safety, forget the lake. Forget the singing. Forget me.